My name is Kevin Fedigan, as mentioned, and I'd be remiss not to start off this call with a message of well wishes to everyone participating today, that you and your families are safe and continue to remain so during these challenging times. At the time this webinar was planned and the topic of IT resiliency was discussed, none of us clearly fathom that we'd be living through a pandemic that surely is testing the resiliencies of many business models and industries on a global scale. In some ways, the timing of this is very apropos, as I'm sure the topic of resiliency, as David mentions, will be revisited by many businesses. I also want to thank CISC for giving me the stage to be able to share some of my experiences in a very broad topic of IT resilience that has largely shaped my career within financial services. And over the next 45 minutes, hopefully we'll impart some of those experiences and keys to success that help define who I am. So a little bit about myself. So I've been a technology leader for over 25 years in financial services and have done this provisionally for 3 organizations. And what I show on the slide here is my career 1.0. The first phase of my career, I was a part of a team that pioneered online brokerage called DLJdirect. And that's where I learned to really adapt to change, given that the newness of the business model, coupled with the newness of everything that was coming at us with the commercialization of the World Wide Web and all the supporting technologies. For the second phase of my career, I managed application development at a global financial solution provider called Pershing. And that's where I led an application team at in launching what is today one of the widely used integrated wealth management platforms. From there, I took lessons that I built upon from my online brokerage experiences, where we did do a significant amount of focus on availability, performance, and resiliency, to a much more holistic approach around resiliency by really focusing on the client experience. And then for my final phase of my career 1.0, as I'm calling it, I was a divisional CIO within BNY Mellon. And that's where I led change through one line of business that had a significant amount of regulatory reform in the post the financial crisis in the tri-party repo markets. And at the same time, in that same division, we were modernizing a platform that cleared upwards of $10 trillion of US treasuries per day. Both those programs were critical to deliver to the marketplace for a myriad of reasons, but the bedrock was to implement a resiliency program to make sure that the outcomes were well regarded. And I'm happy to hear from my former colleagues that the solutions that we put in place are holding up very well despite all the record volumes that are being transacted today. And then my final role at BNY Mellon, I was the CIO of its largest division, asset servicing, where I led a global team accountable for a multitude of critical business services built around the 30+ trillion in custody assets that BNY Mellon is a steward of. And the goal of maintaining that trust was at the upper center of my tenure there. So summing it up, I've managed teams around the globe, ranging from small groups earlier in my career to a division with over 2,400 global associates, and across a multiple of technology disciplines, budgets in excess of $200 million a year. And I have a track record of building resilient products and leaving the businesses a better versions of themselves by the time I moved on, which gave me a peace of mind and comfort in the topic that we're all talking about today. Now I've moved on to my career 2.0, where I've chosen to take a pause from financial services, and I'm helping to provide consultative services where I can and attend events like today to share some of my experiences and successes with all those who care to listen. So what will be, I think, the 3 takeaways I'd like to impart upon everyone who's attending today's call. First, it will be a message around swans, more to come on that in a minute. The second around measurements, and the third around culture. Even though I'll cover more ground than these, I hope everyone can connect back to these messages as you think about your own resiliency programs and approaches within your organizations. First, I think when we think of effective technology leadership, we have to ensure that the 3 parts of the stool, as I represented here, are part of your agenda. Of course, the typical business drivers of growing revenues in a cost-effective manner are important to all of us. But if one doesn't implement a balanced approach and make the required investments in the risk leg of the stool, well, you may find out that you don't have a stool to sit on one day. So building a culture around this risk management into the DNA of one's organization has to be one of every technology leader's goals. So what exactly does it mean to be resilient? One can go into the textbook and look up a definition and find something like Merriam-Webster's definition I have here, where maybe the second part of the definition is more germane to the topic at hand. However, I like to think about resiliency as future-proofing one's businesses. So really, there's always an open sign on your door. It's easier said than done. It requires a lot of effort and focus to be successful in an industry that we know has a lot of long tenured firms, which can bring along a fair amount of technical debt. And in comparison to many of the digitally native businesses that we see growing up around us that are able to leverage out of the gate very strong resiliency technology frameworks and that exist today. So the swans. So as I'd like everyone who's attending to think about the correlation of your incidents or issues or any significant geopolitical or other changes to the swan metaphor. I decided as I was thinking and preparing my material about this analogy as I, like many, chose to social distance in the current environment away from the heart of Manhattan where we live, and decided to come up to the Finger Lakes region, and was fortunate enough to have a friend who had a lake house that is not used in the off season, so been able to camp out on a lake. And as I've been thinking about my messaging, there was often day in day out a nice white swan outside my window swimming around in the lake. So I'm sure many of you have heard the analogies of white swans, gray swans, and black swan events. And credit goes to the author and Professor Nassim Taleb for the black swan metaphor that he wrote about post the financial crisis that soon morphed into the 3 swan paradigm that I'm referencing today. Now, white swans, we all know, are pretty commonplace and obviously my own experience of having seen one. But as you correlate it to the type of incidents or issues, these are the ones that there is the certainty that they will happen, and generally you have a pretty good understanding what the impact is going to be. Gray swans are less common in nature, and as such, they equate to your incidents or triggered by known events, albeit infrequent, but when they do occur, they do have widespread impact to your business. And black swans, we know, are very rare in nature, more likely to see them in captivity than out in the wild, or to show up in a nearby lake or pond. And these are very unpredictable events, but when they do occur, they have extreme impacts. So more to come on the swans. So I've had my experience of dealing with white, gray, and even black swans through my tenure. So we all are challenged with the day-to-day issues, the white swans, where application outages, implementation issues, infrastructure failures do occur. And then I know this is a cyber summit, and I'm sure the topic is talked in great depth in other forums. But these type of events that we go through have a small ripple effect, maybe to a product or to a business or to an application or group of applications, and have a lot of experiences fighting through those. And then I've had my experiences, I'd say, in the gray swan category that are far more disruptive to the businesses that I've been a part of. And a great example is the Hurricane Sandy that sort of took the power out of the Northeast, including many of the areas where we ran our businesses and data centers, and really build muscle mass around our business continuity plans as a result of that, as a good example of something that is known, not likely, but the impact was severe. And then currently, I've gone through what I would characterize as black swan events, such as 9/11, the housing market crash that led to the financial crisis. And these have a severe blast radius to not only our businesses, but to the entire industry at large. And the current COVID pandemic unfolding is being debated in some publications that I've seen as to whether or not it really meets Professor Taleb's definition of a black swan event. But regardless, we know the impact is not in debate and is arguably the most significant impact to many businesses, industries in our lifetime. So how does one take your own experiences and imprint that third leg of the stool into your organizational DNA? Here's the way I'm going to frame the rest of my presentation that's going to serve as a basis for you to use. The first steps are key to influencing your stakeholders with a continuous risk management approach. The second or the third column is that risk is sometimes a very inward focused approach, and I'll talk a little bit of how you also you'd be remiss if you didn't look at outward focus with all the partners, third parties that you and your business may be relying on. Last, I think, is when those swans sneak up on you, how effective is your organization's in its crisis preparedness? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So on to bringing stakeholders along. First, one must create an alignment across your stakeholders, those of which I've listed at the bottom of the slide, and build the partnership across all facets of your stakeholders. To succeed, I strongly believe an organization's executive committee, CEO, or top of the house has to make resiliency a goal within your organization. And that has been the case in the organizations that I've been a part of. From there, a lot of the dominoes will fall in line with all the stakeholders. Technology goals are often aligned to the firm goals and get cascaded throughout an organization. It will end up leading to the right levels of investments and prioritization decisions, and equally important, shared accountability amongst your stakeholders. You'll need the right organizational design to support the paths to building out a resilient organization with measurements to track progress against your goals. All these lead to successful outcomes in an organization, again, based upon experiences that I'm using today to impart upon everyone. But it only becomes sustainable in my eyes when it becomes a cultural norm for a business. Senior leaders clearly come and go, and maybe risk resiliency may fall out of a goal, and organizations could fall back to just focusing on those two legs of the stool, revenues, growth, operational efficiencies, or eliminating costs. And then the gray and black swan events will sneak up on them and bring resiliency back into the fold. So culture is a key message that I think is key to the success of any resilient program in my eyes. I'll give you a minute to let Dilbert do a better job of explaining. So a key question everyone will need to answer and bring in the stakeholders along is to really understand what's one's risk appetite. Now, I fathom to guess that if you were asked your business partners to select from this table which one of the 9's level of resiliency they'd like to see you achieve, I bet most would pick something towards the bottom of the chart. If you then articulated the level of investment associated with that, reaching those levels, I think you'll end up settling somewhere towards the middle or top end part of the chart. It's okay that over time you could strive to achieve the 7 9's paradigm, but it's an iterative aggregate thing, and probably in most businesses can't be accomplished in a single year. So you do need to balance the level of investment if you are creating a risk culture, and the progress will be evolutionary with no beginning and end. So how do we build out a continuous risk management? So I'll get a bit into the how and some of the techniques that I used. So here's a simple framework I created to really bucket the type of activities one should think about when dimensionalizing IT risks. This is by no means exhaustive, but has some broad sweeping topics one should think about as it relates to implementing a resiliency framework. Think of it as an adjustable placemat to fit whatever resiliency competencies you have in place today and the areas you strive to improve upon. Within this framework, the first pillar is how do you prevent those swans from impacting your business in the first place? Many disciplines, such as your software development practices, process frameworks, such as ITIL and other relevant disciplines, can help you achieve an ability to prevent incidents from occurring altogether. The second pillar is you need to have an ability to clearly detect when something happens within your environment and to respond accordingly. So that can be achieved through instrumentation of your applications, through leveraging proactive monitoring tools, making sure the right type of alerting goes out to the people who need to receive them, and that the building out of operation and command centers, both from an infrastructure application point of view, and clearly most organizations have some sort of cyber command center. Then comes when the incidents do come up, how do you quickly diagnose them? What incident management process do you follow? How do you triage all the resources you need to recover your services? And one area that often is overlooked and takes time to get right is how do you communicate to all your stakeholders so that the people who need to restore service aren't distracted, but clearly your clients, your customers, your business partners are going to want to know what's going on, and building that out is important. The fourth facet is recovering. And once you recover, you go into a problem management lifecycle, most likely, where you do root cause analysis. When there's quiet times, you may do scenario planning, implement automation, and ability to replay your business should a repeat incident or swan occur. All of that, I think, ultimately leads to an area of optimization. This is where you, as part of your culture, whether the swans are in play or not, you take the time to think of those gray and black swans, your readiness, and leverage a lot of the technologies that are at your disposal today to improve upon your resiliency paradigm. And this framework clearly has to be supported, as I mentioned earlier, by the right organizational design, people that live this within your teams and live and breathe it day in, day out, followed by a measurements program, which I'll talk about next, and then governance. So now a word about measurements. With measurements, the goal should be to ultimately create actionable insights. So you need to collect, understand, refine, and manage data to lead to those actionable insights. I assume everyone on the call today has a baseline set of organizational metrics that you use to manage. And as I started managing new teams later in my career, one of the first tasks that I would do is to really understand what that baseline level of measurements and metrics are, and then just get a bunch of your subject matter experts, longstanding incumbents, business partners together and brainstorm and throw on the board anything that is perhaps an undocumented risk. Every time I've done this exercise, we would always come out with a large number of new ideas and risks that some could be very specific to the line of business that you're a part of. So, again, going against back to my comments around culture, one needs to create that safe zone in doing this so that all voices can be heard, rewarded, encouraged to come forward so that you can collect those documented risks. And by performing these actions, the number of ideas you measure could balloon, and then it's important that you have the right tool or database to store them in. Then you start to refine and filter through those risks to a manageable number. In the end, you'll need a process and organizational design to continually manage these risks in support of your IT resiliency goals. Again, bringing all the stakeholders along in your program. And I strongly believe, and it was messaged within the organizations that I've been a part of, is that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, providing adage to Peter Drucker. So now on to evidence-based decision-making. So by measuring, we are starting to create an evidence-based culture that drives your decisioning. And as it relates to the type of measurements of risk, I'd always try to think and break those down into themes of people, process, and technology. By capturing metrics, you start to take the subjectivity out of your risk management and make decisions based upon data. The data should substantiate your recommendations to reduce or eliminate risks that in partnership with your stakeholders and be an input into your prioritization decision. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the type of risks that we measured in the various roles that I've been a part of in the areas of people risks, process risks, and technology risks, and what we're doing to achieve the type of outcomes. Throughout my career, I'd find that the majority of businesses that I'd interact with often would start off and be very reactive as it relates to their resiliency programs. They probably would leverage a framework like IDLE, where they would use incidents to hopefully come through a formal process and take corrective actions. And that's where the white swans, which are predictable, you can get them largely under control and reduced impact and repeatability of incidents. But as you go up the maturity curve, the organizations that become more proactive, this is where you start instrumenting your applications, you do deep scanning of your source codes, you look for what your source code, your systems, your infrastructures are telling you without a client needing to report it, and you get to the area where you correct things before the incidents occur. So before those white, black, and gray swans sneak up on you, you now can avoid incidents. And today, I think the ability of an organization to get to a self-healing paradigm exists with the advanced technologies that are in the marketplace, so that you could ultimately get to that self-healing environment. And obviously, I think we all know a well-known example of an organization that has a self-healing framework is Netflix, with its approach to how they do chaos testing, where they inject those swans into their environment day in, day out to demonstrate their ability to continue to deliver their services. And as I mentioned, all my comments so far have been mostly inwardly focused, but it is equally important to understand any existential threats that may exist amongst the third parties, suppliers, and vendors your business is dependent on. Ever since regulations around the globe have started to really impart the need for stronger third-party governance, and you're starting to see much more maturity in these areas. And I know a lot of people attending today's call or do this for a living and be far more articulate in speaking about their approaches and practices and sharing best practices. But one small takeaway, and as it relates to third-party management, is in the end, when you encounter a swan and it impacts a business, irrespective of who was responsible, if it was a third-party hosted solution or a SaaS product or failed infrastructure, a bug in an infrastructure, in the end, you are the accountable party, even though you have other responsible parties around you. And that's why third-party management is hugely important to fold into your risk management program and leverage the same process of cataloging the risks, which may require reaching out and assessing vendors. And you can't boil the ocean. I know at BNY Mellon we had over 10,000 vendors, and we'd have to tier them and spend time with those that provided a critical business service to us. So this whole topic is a meaty topic, and again, there's a lot of people on this call that are probably far more qualified, and perhaps a future webinar on this topic alone would make sense. The last theme that I wanted to cover is really around crisis preparedness. It sort of anchors to the current environment we're all living in today. I think the postmortem on this pandemic will probably be the most extensive, most exhaustive ever in the history of practically all businesses. And it's going to be interesting to see how everyone was prepared for a large-scale business continuity event. We obviously see a lot of innovation, a lot of heroics on the fly, but I'm sure there's a myriad of lessons learned. So crisis preparedness all starts to make sure you have the right playbook in place to deal with these swan events, particularly in the areas of business continuity. Do you have the spare tires in your car should you get a flat, so that you can continue to run your service as you do today? Mature organizations probably have these NOCs that have 24/7 staffing of managing incidents, whether they're the white swans, the black swans, or the gray swans, on a 24 global basis, and certainly the organizations that I were a part of. So crisis preparedness is clearly an element of all the preceding comments, just to show how ready one is when these swan events come up to us, sneak up on us. So a couple key takeaways to impart, and to sum it all up, I want to bring it back to the swans. So don't let the swans chase you. If you do, you're probably in that reactive nature. You build out, take maybe some of the lessons I imparted on you today to figure out what you need to do to go up that paradigm scale of becoming proactive and getting towards a self-healing environment. And it's not going to happen overnight. And I think everyone knows the maturity of one's resilience as either a gut feel or a measured artifact within the organization. So hopefully I was able to give some different angles of helping you manage the swans. The second thing is all about clearly needing to measure. Every organization that I've been a part of, again, we had a culture of high performance and IT resiliency in the businesses that I've been a part of, and we would collect a lot of metrics. You know, in some cases we pivoted it over to 200 to 300 metrics, and you'll find that you can't measure that many, or you can't manage that many. So you do need to go through that refinement process, prioritization process, sharing it with your stakeholders. So we got into the cadence of sharing risks as we dimensionalize them with our business partners, with our second line of defense, which was compliance, and our third line of defense, which was audit, and with our regulators as to what we were doing around de-risking our businesses. And don't forget about, obviously, the third parties. We are an interconnected world, and having a strong discipline around your suppliers, vendors will be key. And the last thing, the frameworks, the approaches that I shared are not exhaustive. I'm sure there are many other areas and buckets and competencies that I could have had on the preceding slides, and they will vary. And I'm sure many of you are at various stages of maturity, but I really think, again, given my experience, that culture is key. Without that culture, where it's in the DNA and the fabric of the organization, that third leg of the stool is as important as chasing revenues or making your organization as efficient as it can be, is the only way that you're going to always be able to have that open side on your door and meet your ultimate objective of being there for your clients and future-proofing your business. So with that, I thank again for giving the opportunity to impart some of my life experiences. I don't believe resiliency should be a competitive advantage for anyone. So I really do appreciate being able to share our experiences in forums like this, because no one should have a business strategy whose goal is to be more resilient than the next person. It just doesn't help an industry. It doesn't help your business. It doesn't help anyone. So I do think the more we can share, the more we can learn on the topics of resiliency. And clearly, being a cyber summit, I didn't even delve into the world of cyber, because I'm certain that is a continuous discussion and among thought leaders. But hopefully you were able to get a few snippets and learn how to manage those swans. And I thank you for this opportunity. And I think at this point, we were going to perhaps open it for questions or comments.
So first of all, thank you so much, Kevin. I think I didn't realize the wealth of experience you have. I mean, it's phenomenal. Lots of questions. People know me, I'm a bit of a gas bag, so I don't want to hog the questions. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start off, and then if everybody else has got questions, they can put them into the question or chat box. Tracy, can we unmute people? Is that possible as well, or is it just better to put it in the chat box?
It would be great. We have one question in the chat box, but what the attendees could do is, if you want to raise your hand, then they could unmute you and you could ask your question that way. So you could either type it in or raise your hand, and we'll do it that way. I just worry about unmuting everybody because we have a good amount of people on, but we'll see how it goes.
So I've got the first question here, actually, which has come from Lev Zawinski. Now, frameworks, the industry is full of frameworks in terms of frameworks for developing solutions, actual, frameworks for the applications, frameworks for the methodologies now, and resilience frameworks. but it appears that sadly, all too often, those frameworks don't have enough robustness, let's say, around the issues of code and code quality. Do you think that's a fair assumption? And what's your experience been with those frameworks to make sure that you maybe have to add in yourself missing parts that can help mitigate risk?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Certainly, frameworks are just that. I think they're guideposts. They are often contributed by organizations and a lot of thought leaders, and give you that blueprint to start with. But often, as the comments made, there may be missing elements, and I wouldn't overthink frameworks. I think we early on in our career, and is still a very important framework, as I mentioned, ITIL. We used ITIL as the framework of managing incidents, problems, service level managements, and it's a great framework. You can, if you implement that and use the tooling around ITIL, it's going to get you to a place. But if you have a goal, as we always did, of trying to get to that self-healing environment, perhaps the frameworks will lead to some gaps, and that's where you have to learn from others. We have the opportunity in financial services, again, being long tenured firms, often with proven track records, but you end up accumulating a lot of technical debt and legacy technologies. And you look around us and you see the digital native businesses who are able to start right on the cloud, that provides a degree of resiliency and leverage a lot of the APM or application performance tools and frameworks, the maturity around code coverage, code quality tools that are out there in the marketplace. I think, I wouldn't overthink or rely too much on the framework. And, what I try to impart is distill those frameworks into some logical groupings and an approach. And what I shared with you was sort of a simpler way of boiling it, but doesn't mean that underneath the covers we wouldn't have lots of variants to frameworks, with, again, that end objective, with alignment with our stakeholders, with a sort of top of the house support that I've always received. And that culture is, how do you ultimately eliminate swans from impacting one's business?
And you've touched on something there, Kevin, about the top of the house support. I know that can be challenging for a lot of people on the line. What have you done in your career to obtain and maintain that support?
Yeah, it's part and parcel. It's that creating those measurements and providing the visibility and transparency is we would do that data gathering and bring it in business terms and sit with our business partners and stakeholders and just articulate what are all these inherent risks, and we need to do the appropriate level of carve out from our annual budgets to make sure we address these risks. And then if you have that continuous approach through governance of bringing these risks back to the table with the measurements that support them and show that you're de-risking a business, you'll see some of the lagging indicators like incidents and the swan sneaking up on people hopefully becoming less impactful when they do occur, and far and few between. So mean time between failures is a good metric to do that. So it's often, unfortunately, the black swans and the gray swan events that sort of wakes up a business. And we see that in the current pandemic, clearly following a lot of industries gravely impacted with volumes or changes in clients' behaviors of an unprecedented scale. And some have gone through bumps and bruises and are going probably through their first sort of life experiences, with now realizing that they probably have to do some things to address the resilience aspects of their businesses. And I think, like I said, is the postmortem on this one, once we get to beyond our new norm, will be extensive, a tremendous amount of innovation, and I think a lot of sort of resiliency lessons will want to be shared across industries to help those that perhaps didn't fare as well as others.
And on the maturity, getting to that stage where you have those predictive analytics, you have that self-healing environment. I know this question is a bit of how long is a piece of string, but how long do you think it is reasonable in months or years before you can, an organization can get to that level of maturity?
I think it got a lot, stems in what one's architecture, their again, as we call it, technical debt exists. That's going to take a much longer trajectory than if you were to build a brand new application. You could clearly, I think, leverage a lot of the approaches and philosophies that are out there today, such as Agile as a way of doing smaller incremental releases, to the whole DevOps world, to test-driven development, behavioral-driven development, whatever. There's just a lot to learn from. Where if you were to build something that new, you could probably, if you put your mind to it, have a very strong offering out of the gate that is highly resilient, whereas those legacy platforms will take longer.
So I'm sort of just talking on mute there, something that I have a habit of doing. So it's interesting you talk about the technical debt, because as an analyst, I mean, that still comes up time and time again, especially in the financial sector, that we are still dealing with vast amounts of technical debt and COBOL systems that never seem to go away. Do you think the current crisis and the focus on some of the issues that we have with a population or developers of like myself on the other side of 50, do you think that this issue might accelerate the transformations and actually starting to reduce some of that technical debt?
I'm not sure this incident will be necessarily a driver of that, unless people had or a business had some real challenges with not having the girth of skills to help them through anything that came their way through this event. Clearly, very publicly, you see some of the newer industries in financial services, some of the newer online brokerages that had challenges with the volumes, probably because again, they didn't have the experience of the dot-com bubble burst like we did, where volumes went exponentially to the financial crisis, where volumes. So you see some elements of disruption in this business associated with probably capacity planning, and I think they'll certainly will be calls to action. And then just we're on a webinar conferences. Clearly, the growth and spurt of everyone working in a social distancing remote world has challenged probably most of the provider of these services, and clearly not only in capacity, but you also see information security concerns, and there's going to be a call to action. So it's definitely going to, I think, create opportunities with people with certain skills to help parallel industries, or even all brand new industries, particularly like the healthcare. Hopefully, take some of these life lessons that we've learned in financial services and see where we can apply them. But I'm not so certain it's going to need, quickly lead to a call to action to, eliminate, let's see, some of these heritage technologies. And, they probably held up pretty well, is my gut feel.
Yeah, I think it's not so much the technologies. I think it's the age of us programmers are used to develop them.
Yeah, I
aren't holding up so
didn't,
well.
yeah, I didn't speak to it, but certainly one of the metrics around the people pillar is you do have to understand, you know, your range of subject matter expertise, how many people are within a retirement zone, and come up with definitive plans, or otherwise you may be caught with not having the ability to support a critical application that's unknown to everyone. So again, making that metric available and socialize with your stakeholders will hopefully yield to a path to de-risking some of those elements.
Okay, and I don't think we've got any questions coming through, but I always like to ask presenters this question. What is your thing that you're going to focus on over the next 6 or 7 months? It doesn't have to be related to what we're talking about today. I always find it quite fascinating to ask a presenter what they see is going to be really important over the next 5 to 6 months. So, you know, with your experience and the things you're involved with, what's going to be your passion, what you're going to be focusing on?
Well, as in the beginning, I sort of talked about my career 2.0. So I did step away from financial services, and am out there trying to share some of my life lessons. And I have managed to sync up with a startup in the healthcare space, and it's just a very opportune industry that is going through a horrific, you know, events in many cities around in countries around the world, that I think, you know, my energy very well may pivot to helping apply things that, you know, we've done within financial services to areas in the healthcare space.
Well, I look forward to hearing about that at some future event, maybe even face to face again. So it now just leaves me to say thank you so much for doing the keynote.